Let's move on to the rest of George Washington's retreat from New York, as he retreats first north and then across the East River and then on through New Jersey towards Philadelphia. But before I talk about that, I do want to mention that one date happens during this time period that becomes critical ultimately. On September 26, 1776, Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane are sent to France by that Second Continental Congress seeking financial and military aid. It is not an easy mission, and it is not one that's accomplished right away, but ultimately it is a mission that makes all the difference in the world. If there are two heroes of this era, of this time for the Americans, they are George Washington, of course, but the other would be Benjamin Franklin, because both of them make significant contributions. So I'm going to go on now and talk about the New Jersey campaign. As I mentioned, Washington was driven out of New York, and once he was out of there, New York stayed under British control all the way until the end of the war. And this probably reflects in part that there were a lot of loyalists there, citizens who were still loyal to the king in England, and that's kind of the way they wanted it. After the fall of Forts Washington and Lee that I talked about previously, the Continental Army crossed the Hudson River, as you can see up here, and retreated across New Jersey. It's hard to call this the New Jersey campaign when it's pretty much a run away from the British forces led by Howe. They retreat towards Philadelphia, first going south and then across country in that direction. The colonials thought they were far enough ahead of the British, and so they stopped briefly in Newark, New Jersey. But then the British troops started to catch up, and they needed to move on. At this point, the Continental Army numbered less than 3,000 men, and not all of them were in that great a shape. But the British, they had 8,000 troops, and they were in hot pursuit of the colonials. They were led by two generals, General Howe and Cornwallis. Both of them played large roles in the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis was there at the end of the war. They are making progress on the colonists, but then the weather turns a little bit bad, and their heavy equipment and wagons get bogged down in the mud of the roads. It's not like they had a super highway to get around on. Fortunately for the colonials, they were not burdened with anything heavy. They were short on weapons, of course. They were way short on cannon, and they were even short on clothing and shoes, and so they were just trying to keep moving and not get caught. They were smart enough, as they retreated, to burn bridges in their wake, which this did slow the British Army down. The British moved on into Princeton, New Jersey, and they attacked the college there. Maybe you've heard of Princeton University. As they did this, Washington was only 12 miles away, and he could not get away at this point because the Delaware River was on the other side, and it's a largish river, and the only way he was going to get across is if he was able to rustle up some boats. And the British Army could have caught the Continentals then and there, but they failed to push on, instead taking on the college at Princeton. Washington ordered Colonel Richard Hampton to gather all the boats along the river. He was a native of Pennsylvania, which is on the other side of the river, and so he knew the area. He had 3 days, and he gathered at least 30 boats, about 30, a little bit more than that. The Continental Army were able to use those 30-some boats to cross the river. The Hessians arrived. Remember, they're the mercenaries that the British hired just as the last boats were leaving the shore, and the American cannons fired from the other side of the river into them to protect the remaining boats. There were no major injuries, of course, but they did fire and helped get them across the river. You may remember that Thomas Paine was an author of a very famous pamphlet called Common Sense. In this time period, he was starting a new pamphlet, and it starts with the words that you see on the page here. These are the times that try men's souls. And that pretty much describes what the Army was going through and what George Washington was going through. The state of the Continental Army in December of 1776 was pretty bad. There wasn't much to look forward to. They were down to less than 5,000 men that were fit for duty, probably quite a bit less than 5,000 men. In addition to that, many of the men who had signed up to be in the Army were scheduled to end their enlistment, the time period that they were going to be with the Army, at the end of the year, which was at the end of the month. And so he's, it's mid-December, and not only is his army already small, men have been captured, men have deserted, men have even joined the other side. But the ones that he does have know that they can go home at the end of the month, and so they're really ready to go. In fact, the Army's spirits were low. They'd had a string of losses in battles, from Long Island to White Plains to Fort Washington, and they were clearly on the run. They were also poorly supplied, and especially in December, for the winter that was coming and for the winter weather that they were experiencing. During this time period, the Congress in Philadelphia was aware that the British were coming, and they abandoned the city because they are fearful of the approaching British armies. I do have an amusing little story for you about General Richard Lee. He was in command of a portion of the Continental Army that had been left north of New York. Washington sent him orders in the way they do at the time, horsemen with written orders, ordered by Washington to march down and meet up with the rest of the army. But Lee sent his own letters back saying, "Hey, I just can't make it yet. My soldiers don't have what they need to march. We're coming, but we're not coming yet." So he traveled only as far as Morristown, New Jersey, and he stopped there and didn't really come any farther. At the same time that he was doing this, he was receiving letters from people that were encouraging him to become the commander of the Continental Army. And he was hoping to get that command of the Continental Army for himself instead of Washington. So it's believed that he was dragging his feet, that he was being slow in going because of that, because he wanted to be the commander and he didn't want to make it easy for Washington. On December 12th, he spent the night away from his army. It was in an inn in a nearby town, and as he sat at breakfast in his nightshirt the next morning, a company of British soldiers surrounded the inn and took him prisoner. Look like I've left a K off here. Let's see if we can put it in. So he kind of made a fool of himself here, didn't he? He remained a prisoner in New York until 1778, so almost 2 years, well, maybe a little less. And at the time, at first, he was treated rather badly by Howe, the general, who saw him as a traitor to the cause. But then Washington interceded on his behalf, and he was treated as a prisoner. And in fact, he was treated pretty well. And he also gave the British advice about how to beat the Americans. I don't know if I'm much of a fan of this guy, this General Lee. Anyway, let's talk now about General Howe's strategy. He recognized that winter was coming on, and so he established a chain of outposts in New Jersey. And he put his soldiers and himself into winter quarters, which for him was pretty good. He occupied the finest quarters in New York, and he lived very well there. He would entertain, he would go to parties, he would hold parties. Probably a pretty good time for General Howe this winter. Meanwhile, General Washington is not having anywhere near such good luck. But there's another good story to tell, and we'll continue on with that next. Thank you.